Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever this may find you in this global village, in this very large circle. My name is Rick Kelly. I live as an uninvited visitor in the lands of the Anishinaabe. Together, they comprise the three nations of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. And together they comprise the Three Fighters Confederacy. Colonial settler terms, that is Tottenham, Ontario, which is about 80 kilometers north of the Greater Toronto Area, a large metropolitan city and urban center, which basically is my hood, where I was born, raised, and done a lot of my initial work. My work is extended now provincially, nationally, and internationally. I'm a trained child youth worker and have been doing that for over 45 years. In my work, I've had the privilege to actually develop, implement, and work in a variety of innovative initiatives, from policy demonstration to mental health to healthcare. And I carried that orientation into my work as a restorative practitioner, which I've been doing for the last 25 years, and also affected a synergy between the two ways of working. Child and youth work is fundamentally relational, and restorative practices is fundamentally relational. Blending the two was actually a marriage made in some sort of other place. And it came together when I was teaching for 17 years at George Brown College. And there I was able to involve many students, agency partners in this particular way of looking at our work and actually transforming it. So this way of working, as I said, I carry forward into my work as a restorative practitioner. Let me share my screen and slides. The title of my presentation and discussion is Practicing Restorative Practices to Transgress, an homage. And it's an homage to bell hooks. And I choose her because much of her work has actually infused my own work and thinking. This quote here actually illustrates the point I am making. I celebrate teaching that enables transgressions, a movement against and beyond boundaries. It's that movement which makes education the practice of freedom. So building on that sentiment and focusing my transgressions around the boundaries that frame restorative practices, that is where I wanted to focus the practices, because it's that movement which makes restorative practices the practice of freedom and transformation. And in doing so, what I want to talk about and touch on in this discussion is second order change, I want to look at the words that we typically use with relational engagement, the window, power, space, making, and voice. I want to employ a systemic lens when looking at individual issues. And I also want to look at and be mindful of the historical and current practices of oppression that exclude, marginalize, and stigmatize so many individuals. So what I want you to do is imagine that restorative practices is like a house under construction. And as you do so, think of this house in terms of its components. It's about spaces and where you build it. It's about the foundation. It's about the construction of scaffolding, so you can build a first and second floor and a roof. It's about all the different windows. It's about who's in the room, about who has and what are the power sources. It's about voices. It's about the design that flows from imagination and creativity. So let's begin with the last point, design. And as Bell Hooks says, thinking critically is at the heart of anyone transforming their lives. Not only does it lead to the transformation of one's own life, but it also can lead to the transformation of the lives of others. And this next initiative demonstrates that. For 4 years, we ran a social innovation hub under the supervision and direction of Natalie Wood and Zubi Saluji, which was an alternative field placement and internship for social service workers, youth practitioners, community workers. And what it did was it allowed those individuals to turn passion into purpose through design thinking, which was based on their lived experience. It embraced principles of social justice, entrepreneurship, social innovation, and social enterprise. It developed a pedagogical framework that promoted social change, and it combined a critical pedagogical, social justice, and restorative justice framework that led to the creation of the HubStar method of entrepreneurship education. This was taken from a summary of the research that was done on this initiative. It also built on the work of Frances Wesley, who was the McConnell Professor of Social Innovation at the University of Waterloo. And what she's argued about social innovation is that it allows for the reintegration of disenfranchised and marginalized individuals and communities in social innovation practices. It allows for the understanding that people who are often pushed to the margins in society because of oppressive actions like racism and sexism often have to find ways to live innovative lives and leads to their own creativity and wisdom. And if they were included in these processes of social innovation, then change could truly happen. This very much accords with what I think is a central principle of restorative practices. That really, we need to center our work around the voices of those most impacted. In fact, not only do we need to center our work, but we need to build around the voices and the articulation of their needs and their understanding of issues. So the Social Innovation Hub was an early stage incubator and connector for the generation of innovative ideas, projects, and social enterprises. It saw 81 college students go through this process over a period of 4 years. They created 33 innovative projects. They generated and built 100+ partnerships in the community and throughout the college. And a number moved their initiatives to the level of being a social enterprise. And a social enterprise is an initiative that in its offerings generates revenue that then can be reinvested in their innovations and efforts towards social justice. So when we think about, after having designed what we want to do, we need to think about where we're going to build this house. Where are the spaces and where do you build? And a couple of initiatives that I was involved in, both early on and later on, really brought home how important that first stage is. My first project was in 2002, working with children under the age of 12. It was funded by the Department of Justice, and it was looking at alternatives for children who, by virtue of what they'd done, if they were older, over the age of 12, they would be deemed criminally responsible. I approached the largest school board in our city, which is actually one of the largest school boards in Canada. And I approached a local community activist and school trustee, who also was a long-term resident of this community called Jane Finch, is shorthanded oftentimes in headlines. And those headlines are usually accompanied by descriptions of violence, poverty, strife, gang involvement. But to those that live in the community, they see it much differently. And similarly, so did Stephanie. And I approached her with this idea and I said, what do you think of this project? That we will engage young people who've committed some actions that have caused harm to others, but use this model of restorative conferencing as a way of helping them take responsibility, be accountable, and engage in a different process, while allowing those who've been harmed to have a voice and be heard. She thought actually was quite worthwhile. But her central concern was that we couldn't run those conferences on the school sites. Those locations were not seen by the community as owned by them, as neutral, as safe. In fact, were often seen as places where violence occurred. So we decided to run these conferences in the community, in community centers and faith locations, which then would give community members a sense of ownership and control over where it happened. That was my first lesson. Fast forward 15 years later, and in the Social Innovation Hub, one of my students, interns, who was involved in the process there, had the idea of actually building a community center in that very community. And that community is described, as I said, oftentimes in the headlines. And she knew this very well because her own son, her 15-year-old son, had been murdered when he was 15 by another youth. But what she wanted to do was to transcend the dynamics and the vicious circles of violence and build a community center in that very community. Now, given the time frame, 8 months, it would have been virtually impossible to achieve that. But really, we were working with ways of thinking. How could we think outside the box and transcend those dynamics and those limitations, where if all you do is respond to what's in front of you, you actually get oftentimes more of the same. You certainly don't prevent those vicious cycles from happening. So we began a process of engaging partners, thinkers, community members. And she carried forward that idea because she'd received enough support and validation for the notion that you could build something based on restorative and peace building principles. She carried that forward into her employment after graduation, and then working with a much larger organization that she was employed by, Toronto Community Benefits, who then approached the agency that was responsible for infrastructure and transit builds across the city and said, in your new endeavor, you're working in this community. Could you give us land to build a community center? And they did. But then 2 years ago, they reneged on the promise. The trouble is when you engage community at the level of their hopes and dreams, and then you take it away from them, that's highly problematic. And it was. The hue and cry from the community was such that it forced the executive director to come to a community forum, public forum, take responsibility for not listening, for not appreciating how important this was, and to agree that this actually would be built, which then also led to the premier of the province, a conservative premier, to also say that he would stand behind this and make sure that it was built. So out of the idea of thinking about something began a process of letting that materialize. So as we stand here right now, next year, 2023, 9 years later, shovels will go into the ground. Which brings us to the point that Bell Hooks makes. The challenge these days is to be somewhere, to belong, to some particular place, invest yourself in it, draw strength and courage from it to dwell in a community. I think many of us know that in the communities that we engage with or live in, we literally have to build those spaces that are safe and seen to be owned by the community itself, which again is a radical notion. These spaces oftentimes do not just exist. So once we have designed the house we're going to build, and then we have found where we're going to build it, we need to create foundations. And those foundations can be varied, whether working with elementary school kids and teaching them how to be peaceful peacemakers and how to be in circle and how to have conversations that might be difficult, or working with youth in the community and bringing them into circle and equipping them with the skills that then will allow them, as one worker did, to engage with the police with circles in the community. We're expanding that out to the next generation of leaders, college students, equipped with the advanced skills around restorative and circle making practices, or university students pursuing their masters or PhDs, and then taking on a variety of different roles as their career moves forward, whether as professors in a college or head of research around diversity in the largest school board in Toronto, or managers of shelters. All of these individuals have expanded their understanding and built capacity in the areas where they have responsibility. Or going back to the community, working with parents who are the leaders in their community to help them build a school as a hub model, built really on the principles of Ubuntu. The more we are connected, the better we all are together, community, school, family. And as we know, every house has many rooms, and each room is unique and has its own characteristics. And there's nooks and crannies, there's closets, and there's hidden areas there, that shelf on the top that has a box in it that you haven't looked into it. So if we imagine that was, and as I often do when I think about restorative practices, the restorative practices has many rooms, and each one has its own particular set of meanings. The one that we're all probably quite familiar with is the room that contains affect theory and talks about how we're hardwired to respond. And when we do that, we often talk about shame because it's so powerful, it's so toxic, and in its stigmatizing form, it's debilitating. But I think that when we talk about that, again, if we were to employ a systemic lens, I think that what we then see is how shame is often layered. So if we were to extract the narrative and discursive elements that reflect those narratives, I think that we see and have a different view of shame. As we know, individuals will walk around and say that they're ashamed. And when it becomes toxic, it becomes more than just that they are ashamed, but they're unworthy, they're unlovable. And that oftentimes will come from people who have responsibility for them, parents, caregivers, teachers. And some of that, though, may be unintentional, but conveyed non-verbally. And sometimes it's conveyed very directly. But another layer of shaming happens when individuals encounter groups. And the narrative they get is that you don't belong here because of sexual identity, gender, race, ability, neurocapacity. The message is you don't belong here. And that becomes a form of outcasting, as Braithwaite says. And then at a societal level, many people, particularly Black individuals, First Nations, persons of color, experience the sense that we have our eyes on you. And these eyes are often described as sort of the white gaze. And in the modern world, the form of surveillance throughout the internet. So there are these layers of shame. Recently, a number of high school students were interviewed from a local school board that has had considerable press and attention to the prevalence of anti-Black racism all throughout the system, to the point at which they were taken over by the Ministry of Education through the government. But these are some of the things that they recently said. One said, I've had a substitute teacher apologize to me for where I'm from, Abulak said. She's from the Sudan. Another said, because of my accent and because I wasn't an immigrant, they said I had to go into ESL, Tawadro said. Her English ability is fine. Her marks are outstanding. And this is not simply one person. I've had teachers surprised that I'm in the class, he said. He is in the academic stream for university. And streaming is quite prevalent. And we know that through the statistical numbers and data that shows that few Black students are found in the academic stream. The classmates suggest that systemic racism might be a factor. The teacher said, no, we don't want to use the word racism, which is some people have privileges that others don't. Students touch her hair without permission, saying the experience made her feel like a dog. I think we can see all the different layers from individual, relational, group, to systemic and societal coming together in the voices of these students. So when we think about shame, it's important that we think about it across a number of dimensions. Not only is it layered, but it's intersectional, as our social identities are. It can also be intergenerational and transmitted across generations of families. This often then is spurred by historical events, which also are manifest in current events as we speak. So when we experience the challenge to decolonize and colorize our practice, these are some of the things that we need to think about. Because when we encounter the bodies in the rooms, depending on which bodies are there, will reflect the individual narratives that are reflective of something much larger and unique. But also, the stigmatizing is not just in words, but it's also in events. And many of us are aware of the impact of adverse childhood events and how that impacts, and the initiative to understand that, how it impacts on future health. But also, it's part of a pathway. From this Scottish Prison Service survey, the odds of having been incarcerated were 20.4 times higher for those who had experienced 4 or more ACEs compared to those who had experienced none. And this is then bounded by what's described as the pair of ACEs. So the prevalence of adverse childhood events is only magnified when people experience adverse community experiences and adverse community environments. So it's not just psychological, but it has to do with the structure and the dynamics at play around some of the fundamentals in community, whether it has to do with housing, food, primary care, work, employment, transportation, access to resources, all of those come into play. So there's a material element to the experience of adversity that then correlates with the shaming experience that people carry with them. And as Bell Hooks said, shaming is one of the deepest tools of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, because shame produces trauma, and trauma often produces paralysis. So the room we opened up focused on affect, and then we talked about shame. But what bell hooks adds in here is how traumatic it is when we contextualize it and how it can lead to paralysis. So that when we think about our work, we then need to think about being trauma informed. And to be trauma informed, we need to use our current understanding of how trauma locates itself in the body and also where we need to begin. So we need to use a different type of continuum, I would suggest, in our work. And it looks like this. We need to disrupt the trauma first. And we do that by naming it to tame it, by putting words on it. Also, by revealing it to heal it. When we shine a light on what is happening for individuals and groups and make that public, it's no longer living within them to the same degree. Their experience is validated. Then we need to begin to help individuals reclaim their body, their sense of emotions, their ability to regulate, to control their own internal processes. And we do that in safe spaces. And we do that because we know the bodies keep the score. And that's often inequitably. And when we've done that and help people regulate, as we co-regulate with them, then we can move to a place where people can begin to deal with the hurts and harms, whether they are taking responsibility and being accountable to those that they have hurt and harmed, or whether they're able to give voice to the hurts and harms that have occurred to them. This begins a reparative process, which then can lead to restoration of the self, those that have caused harm, those that have harmed others, and also restoring the relationships to the people that are close to them, and also to the larger community, which then sets the scene and creates a foundation for, in some cases, transformation of the self and transformation of the systems around us that we all work in, which then allows us to repair the future. So not only do we need to think about, I would suggest, repairing the harms and the hurts which have happened, but also look towards, by our work, how we can repair the future, how we can create the opportunity and the foundation for very different narratives. One of the windows we look at has a window pane in it that says with. But my experience is that actually all paths lead to with, that we don't necessarily start there. Many of the people that I engage with have actually experienced the layering of shaming by being not only having that shaming directed to themselves individually, but through their experiences with groups and within systems. So when you talk to them about, I'm going to share power with you and I'm going to journey with you, that cannot sometimes be a foreign and an unknown concept in their lives, where people have not ever done that with them in positions of authority. So I would suggest that before we get to with, we have to begin a different journey. And I've crafted a model based on the work of Roca. Roca's been working for over 30 years in the Boston area, and now more recently, they have moved to Baltimore. But they have a 5-stage model that very much emphasizes what I see as a fundamental work in the work that I've done. That it begins, first of all, with relational engagement and connection. And that has to take the form of reaching out and reaching in. And as they say, it has to be relentless, but you have to persist, because you need to pass the test of trust before people will actually believe that you are really there for them. And then at that point in time, you can move people into groups, into circles. And there you can provide ongoing support, whether it's around trauma and emotions. You can use that to encourage skill development. And you can also use it as a way of helping people shift their identity around the possibilities for them. And when that happens, and together the power of the circle lifts everybody up, then they can look at the different vocational and educational pathways that are available to them. And in a way, that then addresses the social determinants of health, again, repairing the future, because the primary determinants are education, jobs, and a decent living wage. And this model then was then integrated and served as the basis for this initiative. In 2016, the provincial government had an envelope of funding for Black youth. And in it was an opportunity to look at how this could possibly be relevant to those that wanted to work in the trades. I approached my former intern, who is now working with Toronto Community Benefit Network, Simone Walters, and the director, Rosemary Powell, and with a number of other agencies. I presented this model of relational engagement, circle processes, and pathways into the trades. So this became a process where we introduced mentors into the mix and began this developmental initiative. The idea was to support Black youth who want to work in the trades, become not only successful as tradesmen, but also, and tradeswomen, and also be able to deal with the anti-Black racism that was prevalent throughout the industry. And they would be supported by mentors, senior journeymen who've been successful both as tradesmen, but also dealing with the racism that they encountered. So at this point, 5 years later, we currently have 260 plus mentees in the program at various stages of developing their trade skills, and 30 peer mentors, and probably more, who are providing that ongoing support over a year or more. And by using circle processes, we built community amongst mentees and community amongst mentors, and then brought them together. And as one of the mentors said, this has never happened before, where Black persons were acknowledged for both their skills in the workforce, but also the knowledge that they had to impart to another generation. So our modeling and design thinking needs to also have practical implications. And that's where, when we think about this, then what we're talking about second order thinking. Well, there are many worthwhile initiatives that respond to the harms that are immediate and often come to us through school discipline processes and through the justice system. There's much that can be done to prevent that from happening. Because as someone said, if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you always got. And so we need to think outside of the box and scaffold responses across a continuum of issues and dynamics in order to achieve more substantive and long-standing change. And in doing that, we need to not only think of the individual and the systemic issues, but we need to think of change as also three-dimensional. Much of our work is taking the power and the paradigms of restorative practices out in the wider community. And that's like letting 1,000 flowers grow. But also we want to take it down into the culture and social norms to make that then a political and policy reality for many. As the example of Next Gen Builders, which has now become a backbone project within a larger agency that works with, at this point in time, half a dozen infrastructure builds across the city of Toronto. And when we do that, we're always talking to individuals about change. So there's another dimension we need to think about. We need to talk to people in terms of how they view things, what they're thinking about it, the logic, the data, the cost benefits, the research. But also we need to speak to their heart, because that's where we live, is in the stories of our lives and the stories of other people's lives and how they are affected, both positively and negatively. And then we need to be pragmatic. We need to demonstrate how those things can be done. We need to take our good examples, our templates, and our models and show how they actually demonstrate the worth and the meaning of our words. And as Bell Hooks says, all of us in the academy and the culture as a whole are called to renew our minds. If we are to transform educational institutes and society so that the way we live, teach, and can work can reflect our joy in cultural diversity, our passion for justice, and our love of freedom. So think of our restorative practices house. When we open the doors and the windows, what we should hear cascading out is joy, passion, and love. In other words, really what we want to achieve using that reflective of the central blueprint. Thank you, folks. Hopefully, some of my thoughts and illustrations may be of interest to you. My contact information is available on the conference site. I would imagine that there is a chat function, so people want to chat, and I can link you to some of my other initiatives that I have ongoing right now. One of them is my Facebook site dedicated to restorative practices. Thank you for taking the time and enjoy the rest of the conference.